golden child brother stole my truck, wrecked it, and got arrested. Now my parents blame me. Wait until you hear what I did next, and if my childhood had a soundtrack, it would be the never-ending chorus of my parents saying, "Tyler didn't mean it, Nathan. He's just a kid." That line played on repeat for most of my life, no matter how old Tyler got or how ridiculous his behavior became. I swear you could have put a neon sign over his head that read "Golden Child," and nobody would have questioned it. Tyler was 1 year older than me, which meant for most of our childhood, he used his seniority as an excuse to take whatever he wanted. Toys? Gone. Clothes? Claimed. Even money I'd saved up from mowing lawns would disappear if I wasn't careful. He had this smug, entitled look about him, like the world owed him everything and then some. Meanwhile, I was always the scapegoat, the invisible kid who caught the blame every time Tyler screwed up. Take this one memory that's burned into my brain like a scar. I was 10 years old, and I had just saved up for 3 months to buy the coolest RC car on the market. It was sleek, painted a bright red, with working headlights and these insane wheels that made it fly over sidewalks and grass like it was built for speed. I'll never forget how proud I felt walking out of the toy store, clutching that box like it was treasure. It was treasure to me. Tyler, of course, zeroed in on it the moment I brought it home. He was 11, plenty old enough to know how to respect someone else's property, but that didn't matter. "Let me try it," he whined, practically vibrating with impatience. "Not yet," I said, shaking my head. "I just got it, Tyler. Let me enjoy it first." "You're so selfish," he shot back. "What's the point of having it if you don't share?" Looking back, I wish I'd held my ground, but back then, I wanted my parents to see me as the good kid, the one who shared, who didn't cause problems. So like an idiot, I handed him the remote. "Just be careful," I warned, already feeling the knot of regret in my stomach. Tyler didn't even pretend to listen. Within minutes, he had the car screaming down the driveway, laughing maniacally as he turned the wheel sharp and fast. Before I could stop him, the car shot straight into the curb. There was a loud crack, and then silence. I sprinted over, hoping against hope that it wasn't as bad as it sounded. It was worse. The front wheel had snapped clean off, and the body was scratched to hell. My brand new treasure, destroyed. Tyler laughed. He actually laughed. "Whoops," he said, grinning like it was the funniest thing in the world. I ran inside, tears streaming down my face, cradling the broken car in my arms. "Mom, Tyler broke it. I told him to be careful and he..." Linda, my mom, didn't even look up from the magazine she was reading. "Nathan, boys will be boys. You can't expect him to be careful at his age. He's not a toddler," I shouted, desperate for her to take my side. "He's almost 12. "Enough," she said sharply. "Stop overreacting. It's just a toy." That was the moment it clicked for me. Tyler could do whatever he wanted, and I would always be the one told to let it go. By the time we hit our teenage years, things only got worse. Tyler wasn't content to just take my toys anymore. Now it was my clothes, my bike, and whatever money I managed to scrape together from odd jobs. I remember when he borrowed my bike to ride to school. It was my pride and joy, a shiny blue Schwinn that I'd bought secondhand after mowing a dozen lawns over the summer. Tyler never brought it back. When I finally tracked it down 3 days later, it was lying in a ditch on the side of the road, soaked and rusted from being left out in the rain. "Why didn't you just take care of it?" I shouted at him when I found him lounging on the couch, unfazed. Tyler shrugged, barely looking up from the TV. "I forgot where I parked it. Chill out." When I tried to complain to my parents, my mom just sighed like I was the problem. "Nathan, you need to learn how to share. He's your brother." Share? I wanted to scream. How was I supposed to share something when he didn't care enough to respect it? The double standard in our house was impossible to ignore. When Tyler broke something, it was just a mistake. When I asked for gas money to get to school or supplies for a project, it was, "You need to learn the value of money, Nathan. Life doesn't give handouts." I was out shoveling driveways, babysitting, and mowing lawns while Tyler coasted through life, wrecking everything in his path. And he did wreck everything. Tyler got his first car when he was 16, a beat-up old Dodge Neon that our dad, Robert, paid for. He didn't even make it 6 months before he smashed it into a telephone pole because he thought it'd be funny to drift in the snow. Did he face any consequences? Nope. My parents scraped together the money to get him a replacement, another junker, this time a Pontiac that he crashed within the year. He's young. My mom said when I asked why they kept rewarding his recklessness. He'll learn. I wanted to scream. What about me? When was I going to get a car? Or was I just supposed to keep walking to school in the Ohio winters because I hadn't been born with Tyler's golden boy halo? The tipping point came when I turned 18. By then, I'd had enough of the excuses, the favoritism, and the blame. It started with my laptop. It was the only thing I'd managed to save up for that I truly needed. I used it for school, work, and applying to colleges. One night, I found it shattered, screen cracked, keyboard smashed, completely useless. Tyler, I hissed, storming into his room. What did you do to my laptop? He didn't even look guilty. I borrowed it and dropped it. Chill out. You shouldn't have left it where I could get it. I saw red. That was it. I wasn't going to let him destroy one more thing I worked for. That night, I called Uncle Hank, my mom's older brother. Uncle Hank was a retired cop, a no-nonsense kind of guy who didn't put up with excuses. He'd always been the only adult in my life who actually saw Tyler for who he was. Pack your bags, he told me after I explained everything. You're coming to stay with me. It was the first time in my life I felt like someone had my back. Uncle Hank didn't just give me a place to stay. He gave me something I'd never had before: independence. He handed me the keys to his old 1993 Chevy Silverado, a truck he'd driven for years before retiring. She's seen better days, he said as I stared at the truck in awe. But she's reliable. Take care of her, Nathan, and she'll take care of you. That truck wasn't just a vehicle to me, it was freedom. For the first time, I had something that was truly mine, and I swore to myself that no one, not Tyler, not my parents, would take it from me. Of course, Tyler had other plans. Moving in with Uncle Hank felt like stepping into an entirely new world. His house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Toledo, Ohio, wasn't anything fancy, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived. Hank was a straight shooter. He didn't sugarcoat things, but he was fair, and he treated me like an adult, something my parents never did. The first morning after I moved in, I found Hank sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. He looked up as I walked in, still in my pajamas, and nodded toward the stove. I made extra if you're hungry. And Nathan, you're gonna start pulling your weight around here, all right? I froze for a second, worried this was about to turn into one of those "you're lucky I'm helping you" lectures I always got from my parents. But then Hank continued, "I'll show you how to take care of the truck later. Oil changes, brakes, the works. Owning a truck means knowing how to keep her running." That was it. No lectures, no guilt trips. Just Hank teaching me how to be responsible in a way that didn't feel like punishment. It was refreshing. The Chevy Silverado was parked in his driveway, a big, solid beast of a truck with a dull green paint job that had seen better days. The bumper was a little crooked, and the interior smelled faintly of gasoline and coffee, but I didn't care. It was mine. The first time I climbed behind the wheel, Hank leaned against the passenger side window and grinned. "Drive her slow for now, kid," he said. "She's sturdy, but she's not invincible. Take care of her, and she'll get you where you need to go." I promised I would. For the first time in my life, I felt free. That truck was my key to independence. I used it to get to my new job at a local hardware store, where I worked stocking shelves and helping customers haul lumber and tools to their cars. The Silverado quickly became more than just transportation. It became a tool in itself. I started doing side jobs, helping people move, hauling junk to the dump, even picking up furniture deliveries for neighbors. Every dollar I earned felt like a win, like proof that I didn't need my parents or anyone else to bail me out. But, of course, Tyler couldn't stand that. The first time I drove the Silverado over to my parents' house, it took him about 10 seconds to start whining. "Where'd you get the truck?" Tyler asked, narrowing his eyes as he stood on the driveway with his arms crossed. "Uncle Hank gave it to me," I said, walking past him and ignoring the look on his face. "You didn't even pay for it?" he sneered. "Must be nice to get handouts." That was rich coming from Tyler. I turned to face him, my voice steady. It's not a handout. Hank gave me the truck because I take care of it, and I earn my own way. You wouldn't understand. Tyler's face turned red, but before he could snap back, Mom stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel. What's going on out here? Nothing, I muttered, shaking my head. Tyler, of course, had to start his usual whining. It's not fair, Mom. Nathan gets a truck, and I don't have anything. You wrecked 3 cars, I shot back. Maybe if you took care of your stuff, you'd still have one. Enough. Mom's voice cut between us like a knife. Nathan, you don't need to rub it in. Tyler, stop acting like a child. But that was the thing. Tyler was a child, at least mentally, and my parents never made him grow up. A few months later, Tyler totaled his 3rd car. It was an old Pontiac Grand AM that my dad had bought him after he wrecked his last one. Tyler was driving too fast on a rainy day, and he smashed straight into a street pole. I wasn't surprised when I heard about it, but I was furious when Mom called me later that week. Nathan, she said, trying to sound casual but failing. Your brother's in a bit of a bind. He doesn't have a car now, and it's hard for him to get to work. I knew where this was going. What does that have to do with me? Well, there was a long pause before she finally said it. You have the truck, and you don't use it all the time. Maybe you could let him borrow it, just until he gets back on his feet. No, I said immediately. Nathan, she said, as if I just insulted her. You're being selfish. Your brother really needs this. Family helps family. No, I repeated, firmer this time. Tyler wrecked 3 cars, Mom. I'm not letting him touch my truck. It's how I get to work. I rely on it. She tried the guilt trip next. You can take the bus for a few days. It's not like you have far to go. Not happening, I said, and I hung up. For the next week, I got the cold shoulder from both my parents. Every time I stopped by their house to grab something, Mom would mutter under her breath about how I was being unreasonable. Tyler, meanwhile, just sulked and avoided me like I'd kicked his dog. But I didn't care. I wasn't letting him ruin the one thing in my life I could depend on. I knew Tyler. He didn't hear the word no the same way other people did. To Tyler, no just meant find another way to get what you want. And sure enough, a few days later, Tyler did exactly that. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished up a long shift at the hardware store. I walked into the parking lot, heading toward the spot where I always parked the Silverado, far enough away from other cars so no one would ding it. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The truck wasn't there. At first, I thought I was just tired and maybe I parked it somewhere else. But after walking the entire lot twice, the truth sank in like a stone in my stomach. Tyler. I pulled out my phone and called him, my hands shaking with anger. He answered after a few rings, his voice casual and chipper. Hey bro, what's up? Where's my truck? I demanded. Oh, relax, he said, like it was no big deal. I just borrowed it for a bit. I'll bring it back soon. You stole my truck, I snapped. Bring it back right now, or I'm calling the cops. You're overreacting, Tyler said, scoffing. It's just a truck. Chill out. He hung up before I could say another word. My blood felt like it was boiling under my skin. I didn't know how he'd even gotten into the truck. I always kept the keys with me, but then it hit me. A couple months back, I'd read something online about certain models of Chevy Silverados having keys that were easy to replicate if you knew the VIN number. Tyler had gone out of his way to make a spare key just so he could steal my truck. I stood there, pacing and seething, until finally, about half an hour later, Tyler pulled into the lot. The truck was covered in mud, fast food wrappers littered the passenger seat, and there was a faint smell of cigarettes hanging in the air. Tyler climbed out with that smug grin on his face and tossed me the keys. See? No harm, no foul. I lost it. What the hell is wrong with you, Tyler? You stole my truck, trashed it, and you think this is funny? Relax, he said, shrugging. It's just a truck. To him, it might have been just a truck, but to me, it was my lifeline, and I wasn't about to let him ruin it. After Tyler handed me back the keys, his smug grin still plastered on his face, I couldn't even speak. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to throw him into the mud he'd tracked all over my truck and see if he'd laugh about that too. Instead, I climbed into the Silverado, shut the door harder than I needed to, and just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to calm down. Inside, the truck was a disaster. Fast food wrappers were stuffed in the cup holders, soda stains marked the fabric seats, and the cigarette smell was thick enough to choke on. I knew Tyler didn't smoke, so he'd probably picked up one of his low-life friends and let them trash the cab. It felt like a personal violation. This truck wasn't just some beat-up vehicle, it was mine. The one thing I could rely on. Tyler didn't get that. He never would. The drive back to Uncle Hank's was slow because I spent half the time trying not to lose it completely. By the time I got home, the anger had turned into something colder and heavier. I found Uncle Hank in the garage working on his motorcycle, the smell of oil and grease thick in the air. "You look like you're ready to murder someone," he said without looking up, his wrench clinking against the engine. "Tyler stole my truck," I said, my voice tight. "He made a spare key and took it without asking." That got his attention. Hank straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "What?" "He trashed it too. Mud everywhere, food garbage, cigarette smoke. I don't even know how I'm going to clean it." Hank's jaw clenched, and for a moment, I could see him biting back his first reaction. "Did you call the cops?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I wanted to, but it's my brother, you know? I didn't want to go that far." Hank sighed, tossing the rag onto his workbench. "Nathan, listen to me. Tyler's never going to learn until someone forces him to. You give him an inch, he'll take everything you've got. That truck is your lifeline. Next time, you don't call him. You call the police." I nodded, even though it felt like a betrayal to say it out loud. Calling the cops on your own brother? I couldn't imagine my parents forgiving me for that. Then again, they never forgave me for anything I did. So maybe it wouldn't make a difference. "You need to protect yourself," Hank said firmly. "No one else is going to do it for you." He offered to help me install a GPS tracker in the truck the next morning. "Just in case," he said. "If he pulls something like this again, you'll know exactly where the truck is." I spent 2 hours cleaning out the truck that night, scrubbing its stains and spraying air freshener until my arms ached. It still smelled faintly like smoke, and there were bits of mud I couldn't reach under the pedals. The whole thing left me simmering with frustration. I'd spent so long working to build my own life, my own space, only for Tyler to waltz in and trash it like it was his right. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning. The second theft. For a few weeks, everything was quiet. Tyler avoided me, probably because he didn't want to hear me chew him out again, and my parents gave me the silent treatment too. They were good at that, acting like I was the bad guy for not letting their golden child get away with murder. I didn't care. I had my truck back. I was working more shifts at the hardware store, and for once, it felt like my life was my own. Then Christmas rolled around. Every year, my family gathered at my parents' house for Christmas dinner. It wasn't that I looked forward to the holiday. I didn't. But I still went. Not for my parents, or for Tyler. I went for Uncle Hank and my cousins, who were the only people in my family I actually wanted to see. And, honestly, I went for the food. I showed up late in the afternoon, truck parked neatly at the end of the driveway where I could keep an eye on it. The second I walked through the front door, Mom greeted me with her usual passive-aggressive flair. "Oh, Nathan," she said. Her smile stretched too thin to be genuine. "I wasn't sure you'd come after all the drama you caused this month." I ignored her, shrugged off my coat, and headed straight for the kitchen where Uncle Hank was already camped out with a mug of coffee. "Merry Christmas, kid," he said, giving me a firm pat on the shoulder. "Ignore your mother. You know how she is." "I'm used to it," I said, grabbing a cookie off the counter. The day dragged on like every other family gathering. Chaotic, loud, and suffocating. My mom kept making digs at me whenever she thought no one was listening. "Nathan's gotten so protective of that truck," she said to one of my cousins. "It's like he thinks it's worth $1 million." I clenched my jaw but stayed quiet. No point starting a fight. Meanwhile, Tyler sat in the corner glued to his phone, barely speaking to anyone. I figured he was sulking because I'd shut him down so hard last time we talked. That suited me just fine. By the time evening rolled around, I was more than ready to leave. But then I noticed something. My truck keys, always clipped to my belt loop, were missing. I froze. At first, I thought maybe they'd fallen off somewhere, So I retraced my steps through the house. The living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Nothing. My stomach dropped as I bolted for the front door and looked out the window. The driveway was empty. My truck was gone. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I ripped my phone out of my pocket and opened the GPS tracker app. Sure enough, the dot representing my truck was already miles away, moving fast. I didn't even have to think about it. I called Tyler. He picked up on the third ring, sounding way too casual. "Relax, bro. I'm just picking up a friend," he said like it was no big deal. "You stole my truck," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "Where are you?" "I'll bring it back," Tyler said, brushing me off. "It's not like you need it right now. Chill out, Nathan. It's Christmas." I was done. I didn't care if it was Christmas. I didn't care what my parents would say. I hung up the phone, grabbed Uncle Hank, and stormed out of the house. "Tyler took my truck," I said as we climbed into Hank's car. "I've got his location on the tracker." Hank didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened as he pulled onto the road. I stared at the GPS app on my phone, watching the dot slow down and stop near an exit ramp off the highway. That's when I saw it. My truck, nose deep in a snowbank on the side of the road. The front bumper was crumpled, the left headlight shattered, and the grille looked like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. Tyler stood off to the side of the road. His arms crossed like this was all just a minor inconvenience. "It's not that bad," he said when I got out of the car, his voice defensive. "The roads were icy. It's not my fault. You wrecked my truck," I said through gritted teeth. "What the hell were you thinking?" Before Tyler could answer, a police cruiser pulled up behind us, lights flashing. My stomach sank. This was about to get a whole lot worse. The police cruiser pulled up slowly, its lights cutting through the snowy darkness. For a brief moment, all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the crunch of boots on frozen gravel as the officer climbed out. Tyler shifted nervously beside my wrecked truck, his earlier smugness now replaced with an awkward attempt to look innocent. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, glancing between the Silverado and the two of us. His voice was calm but firm. I didn't even let Tyler speak. "He stole my truck," I said, my words sharp and steady. "I have the GPS logs to prove it. He didn't have permission to drive it, and he crashed it." The officer looked at Tyler, his expression unreadable. "Is that true?" Tyler stammered, his face turning red. "I mean, I borrowed it. It's my brother's truck. It's not like he was using it." The officer's eyebrow shot up. "Did you have permission to take it?" Tyler hesitated just a second too long. "Well, not exactly, but that's called theft," the officer said flatly, cutting him off. "You crashed it too?" "The roads were icy," Tyler said, throwing his hands in the air. "It's not like I meant to." Before I could say anything else, Uncle Hank stepped in. He had been standing a few feet back, arms crossed, silent up until now. "Officer, you might want to give him a breathalyzer," Hank said, his voice calm but cold. "Something tells me he hasn't been driving sober." I saw Tyler freeze. His eyes darted toward the officer for a split second, and I knew Uncle Hank had called it. The officer frowned and nodded. "All right, son, let's check that out." Tyler muttered something under his breath as the officer led him over to the cruiser. I watched as they went through the motions, the breathalyzer, Tyler's stumbling excuses, and the way the officer's face hardened when the results came back. "All right, that's it," the officer said, grabbing his cuffs. "You're under arrest for driving under the influence and operating on a suspended license." I watched as Tyler's face fell, his bravado completely wiped away. Wait, this is a mistake," he said, trying to backpedal. The officer didn't care. He cuffed Tyler and guided him toward the car as Tyler started yelling, "Mom and Dad are gonna kill you for this, Nathan." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. A few minutes later, my parents' van screeched to a halt behind the cruiser. My mom practically fell out of the passenger seat, her coat flying open in the freezing wind as she ran toward us. My dad followed, moving slower but looking just as frantic. "What's going on here?" my mom demanded, her voice shrill. She spotted Tyler being loaded into the back of the police cruiser and turned to me with fire in her eyes. "What did you do?" "What did I do?" I shot back, incredulous. Tyler stole my truck. He wrecked it. He's been drinking, Mom. He did this to himself. The officer stepped in before she could scream at me. Ma'am, your son was caught driving under the influence on a suspended license. He crashed the vehicle. This isn't something we can ignore. My mom looked like she might faint. This is all a misunderstanding, she said quickly, her voice wobbling. He's a good kid. He just made a mistake. Uncle Hank snorted behind me. How many times have we heard that one? He muttered. She turned on him next. Hank, you're not helping. This is family business. We don't need the police involved. It stopped being family business when Tyler stole a vehicle and endangered people's lives. Hank replied coolly. Robert, my dad, finally spoke up, stepping between them like a referee. Let's all calm down, he said, his voice the forced kind of calm that only made me angrier. Tyler made a mistake, but we'll sort this out. You're not sorting anything out, I said, my voice rising. He stole from me. He trashed my truck, and he's getting exactly what he deserves. You didn't have to call the police, Nathan, my mom shouted, tears welling up in her eyes. He's your brother. I didn't call the cops. The GPS tracker led me here, and someone else called it in, I said, pointing at the flashing cruiser. But I should have called them the first time he took it. The officer interrupted before things could spiral further. Ma'am, sir, he said to my parents, we're taking him to the station. You can sort out bail later. As the cruiser pulled away, Tyler glaring at me through the window, my mom's shoulders sagged. She turned to me with an expression I'll never forget. Some twisted combination of anger and disappointment. How could you let this happen to your brother? I laughed bitterly. You're kidding, right? He stole my truck. He did this to himself. My dad shook his head like I was the one being unreasonable. You could have handled this privately, Nathan. You didn't need to make a scene. Handled it privately? I repeated, almost laughing. You mean let him get away with it again? No, not this time. Hank put a hand on my shoulder, stepping between me and my parents. Let's go, Nathan. You don't need to stand here and justify yourself. We turned and walked back to Hank's car. I didn't look back at my parents. The aftermath. The fallout started the next day. My mom called me before I was even awake, leaving a voicemail full of tears and guilt trips. Nathan, you have to fix this. Tyler's been through enough. How could you let him sit in jail? I didn't answer. I didn't care. Uncle Hank, on the other hand, looked almost proud of me when I told him about the voicemail. Good, he said simply. Maybe this will finally teach Tyler that actions have consequences. That afternoon, I got another call, this time from Tyler himself. Somehow, he'd managed to get access to a phone from the county jail. I let it ring a few times before picking up, mostly because I wanted to hear what he had to say. Nathan, he said, his voice trembling just enough to sound pitiful. Look, man, I'm sorry, all right? I screwed up. I just need you to bail me out. I rolled my eyes. No. Come on, man, please, he begged. I can't stay in here. You don't know what it's like. Maybe you should have thought about that before you stole my truck, I said coldly. Nathan, I'm your brother, he shouted, his voice cracking. You can't leave me here. I hung up without another word. A few minutes later, my mom called again. I picked up this time, just to see how far she'd go. Nathan, she started, her tone wavering between anger and desperation. Your brother needs you. He's in a terrible place right now. We don't have the money to bail him out. Then let him sit there, I said, cutting her off. He stole my truck. He wrecked it. He got himself arrested. That's on him, not me. You're breaking this family apart, she said, her voice rising. No, Mom, I replied, my voice calm but firm. Tyler did that. You let him do it, over and over again. And I'm done cleaning up his messes. I hung up and blocked her number. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The silence in the days that followed was almost eerie. My phone sat on my nightstand, quiet for the first time in what felt like years. I kept it that way, ignoring any unknown numbers, knowing exactly who it was. My mom, my dad, and probably even Tyler were all desperate to drag me back into the mess I'd spent my whole life trying to escape. But I was done. For years, I had played their game. I'd let them guilt me into forgiving Tyler's endless list of mistakes and brushed off every insult they threw my way when I stood up for myself. Not anymore. The moment I blocked their numbers, I felt lighter. It was like cutting off a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. Still, the fallout didn't take long to arrive. A week after Tyler's arrest, I was in Uncle Hank's garage, helping him replace the spark plugs in his motorcycle. The quiet hum of the radio filled the space as Hank wiped grease off his hands and tossed me a wrench. "You hear anything from your folks yet?" Hank asked, though he probably already knew the answer. "Nope," I replied, crouched beside the bike. I blocked their numbers after Mom tried one last guilt trip about how I'm destroying the family. Hank snorted. Typical Linda. Always blaming someone else. He paused, shaking his head. "Good on you, kid. They're going to try to pull you back in, though. You sure you're ready to hold that line?" "I'm sure," I said without hesitation. Hank didn't say much else after that. He just gave me a nod and went back to work. That's one of the things I appreciated about Uncle Hank. He never pushed. He gave advice when I needed it, but he let me make my own choices. Later that night, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't the casual kind of knock from a neighbor dropping off cookies. It was a loud, impatient thud that made my stomach twist. I already knew who it was before I even opened the door. Standing there in the freezing cold were my parents. My mom with her coat wrapped tightly around her, eyes sharp, and my dad looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Nathan," my mom started. Her voice clipped. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "There's nothing to talk about." "Don't do this," she snapped, her voice shaking. "Your brother is struggling right now, and you're making it worse. This is not how family treats each other." "How family treats each other?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You want to talk to me about family after all these years? After everything Tyler's done to me? He's your brother," she said, her voice softening, like she thought she could change my mind with pity. "You're supposed to support him." "I've supported him my entire life," I shot back. "I've watched you cover for him over and over again, no matter how badly he screws up. And every single time, I'm the one who gets blamed when I don't fall in line. That's not fair, Nathan," my dad cut in. "You're making this into something bigger than it is. Tyler made mistakes, but we're trying to help him get back on his feet. You should be doing the same." "No," I said firmly. "That's where you're wrong. Tyler didn't just make mistakes. He stole from me. He destroyed the one thing I've worked hard for. And he's never been held accountable for anything because you two refused to let him face the consequences." My mom threw up her hands. "You're being unreasonable. Do you think you're perfect, Nathan? You've made mistakes too." "Maybe I have," I said, my voice low, "but I've owned up to every one of them. I've worked for everything I have, and I didn't expect anyone to bail me out when I messed up. Tyler's a grown man, Mom. He needs to figure this out on his own, and I'm not going to be part of your endless cycle of excuses. You don't understand what it's like to be a parent," she said, her voice trembling now. "You don't know how hard it is to see your child in trouble. You'd do the same thing if it were your kid." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I wouldn't, because I'd raise my kid to take responsibility for their actions. I wouldn't let them walk all over everyone else." My dad took a step forward, his voice softer now. "Nathan, we're not asking for much. Just let Tyler stay with you for a while. He's got no job, no car, and nowhere else to go." I almost laughed at how absurd it was. "Are you serious? After everything he's done, you think I'm going to let him into my home? Let him trash my life the way he's trashed his own? It's not like that," my mom pleaded. "He just needs a little help to get back on his feet." "No," I said for the last time. "You want to keep enabling him? Go ahead. But I'm done. You've made it perfectly clear that Tyler will always come first. I don't owe you, or him, anything." They stood there, speechless for once. My mom's face crumpled like she wanted to cry, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. My dad just looked tired, as if this whole situation was somehow my fault. Without another word, I stepped back inside and closed the door in their faces. For a long time, I just stood there in the silence, my heart pounding. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty, either. I just felt done. The next morning, I woke up to a long voicemail from my mom. I didn't even listen to it before deleting it. Then there were texts, angry ones, desperate ones that tried to guilt me into changing my mind. I ignored every single one of them. Meanwhile, Tyler stayed in jail for a while longer. My parents eventually managed to scrape together enough money to bail him out, borrowing from family and dipping into their retirement fund. When I heard about it through Uncle Hank, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Tyler came straight to their house after he was released, sulking like a teenager. I stopped by once to grab a box of my old tools from the garage, and when I walked through the living room, he didn't even look up from the couch. He just sat there, staring at the floor, muttering about how unfair everything was. I didn't say a word to him. There was nothing left to say. Over the next few months, Tyler's life continued to spiral. He couldn't get his license back because he couldn't afford the fines, and he struggled to hold down a job. My parents gave him everything they could: money, excuses, second chances, but it was never enough. One afternoon, Uncle Hank and I were sitting on the back porch drinking coffee when we saw Tyler pull up in my parents' old minivan. He was working as a pizza delivery driver now, and the look on his face when he spotted us was priceless. Hank gave him a little wave and said, "Good to see you working, Tyler. Keep it up." Tyler mumbled something and practically ran back to the van. I couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in his life, he was being humbled. But no matter how far he fell, my parents still refused to see him for who he was. They still called me sometimes, leaving messages that I deleted without listening. My mom's voice, always so familiar, felt like an echo of something I'd left behind. "Nathan, you're breaking this family apart." No, I thought. I'm finally putting myself back together.